War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, A Flame Too Far. He caught himself daydreaming. He did this way more than he should lately. The window was fogged up and the raindrops pattered against it. He could see the gray sky, but not in detail. The room itself was quiet, except for the occasional cough and the sounds of pencils scraping against paper. His thoughts had been wandering into a world within his imagination. A world where this war was not a thing. A world where he still worked on railway cars, trying to improve them, trying to make them more comfortable. A world where he was trying to help an industry outpace an emerging competitor, the motor car. Instead, he was plucked from the job he loved to work for Germany's Artillery Testing Commission. Instead of designing more practical and comfortable railway cars, he was here trying to create weapons that boys were using on the front. Instead of making lives comfortable on the rails, he helped take them. As much as he despised what he was doing now, he thanked his lucky stars that his education at the Technical University of Darmstadt kept him from having to fight. He glanced around the crowded room. 2 months before, it had held 7 people. Now it held 24. The space was packed with small desks like his, each one stacked with papers filled with ideas and designs of things meant for one thing: to kill. In front of him lay a drawing of a new grenade design. The engineer behind it claimed that it would easily displace the popular and effective stick grenade design that was currently in use. The design itself was much like the grenades currently in use by the French and British troops. It was oblong in shape. It had the ridges that were meant to break off and spread out as shrapnel. But what set this design apart was the carve-out in the metal for fingers. The notes claimed that this would make it easier to grip and throw, especially in rainy weather. He picked up the paper and placed it in the rejected idea bin for later burning. Finger ridges, he said to himself and scoffed. Doesn't even account for gloves. He looked up at the electric lights in the ceiling. He could hear the low hum of the current flowing through the fixtures. What an invention, he thought to himself. What I wouldn't do to be involved in something like that, he said aloud but quietly. Something like what? Asked the man at the desk adjacent to his. His name was Fritz Schlesinger, a fellow engineer. Infrastructure, he answered. Can you imagine the pride one would have when seeing your idea, your design, come to fruition? Look at the lights. Think of all of the power stations that had to not only be built, but the wire that was needed to be placed to connect them. That's what I want to do when this damn war is over. But I thought Hermann Klein loved the railway job, Fritz asked sarcastically. I do, but imagine being part of something bigger. Fritz grew a devilish grin. I get it. That's why I want to work making motor cars. Hermann looked at his coworker, his friend. That's disgusting, and made a slapping gesture with his hand. Fritz laughed, throwing his hands up in a fake defensive posture. The door to the room swung open and banged against the wall. Hermann and Fritz turned towards the abrupt noise. A figure stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping off his dark brown derby hat. Hermann recognized the man instantly. It was Richard Fiedler, the head of the department. The look on his face was hard to place. Was it anger? Stress? Confusion? Hermann did not know. Fiedler left the door open as he entered and removed his wet hat, revealing his dark brown hair that was graying at the temples, his blue eyes surveying the room. He had an office at the end of the room, but he did not head towards it. Instead, he sat on the edge of a junior engineer's desk, pushing the man aside. He was not polite about this, but not rude either. It was obvious something had happened. Hermann looked at Fritz and spoke quietly. "I'm taking it that the meeting with command didn't go well." Fiedler looked at the ceiling, took a deep breath, and began. "Gentlemen, as you all know, this morning I had a meeting with General von Falkenhayn as well as von Pleasant. There were others there, but who cares?" Now he stood, setting his wet hat on the stack of papers on the junior engineer's desk. The junior engineer moved quickly to pull it away before the drawings were ruined. Fiedler took no notice. He continued. "The front is at a standstill. Imagine, if you will, two armies entrenched in their lines and unable to move. It's practically a stalemate out there, with thousands of men dying every single day." He let the words hang in the air a moment. The room was quieter than Hermann had ever heard it. The men focused on Fiedler, daring not to say a word. Fiedler started to pace the room, back and forth, 3 steps to the right, then 4 steps to the left. He didn't say a word for 30 seconds or more. He sat back down on the desk and began again. "They want us to solve the problem." Small pockets of quiet conversations erupted around the room. Fiedler held up his hands, and the room fell silent once again. "They want a war-defining weapon from us in this room. One that can end the stalemate and allow the army to regain its mobility and start pushing the enemy back, to create a strategic advantage over the enemy, wear them down, and force them to capitulate." Hermann, who had recently read Gibbon's History of the Roman Empire, blurted, "What do they want from us? Greek fire?" Fiedler stared at him from across the room. He was silent and perfectly still. Then, without a word, he stood, glanced once towards his office door at the end of the cluttered space, and suddenly broke into a sprint. Hermann and the rest of the room were perplexed. "Was it something I said?" Hermann asked. The sun was shining as Hermann, Fritz, and several others stood in a wide field just outside of Berlin. They had all ridden out in a transport truck to witness the newest test, whatever that meant for them. A month earlier, after Hermann's careless Greek fire remark, Fiedler had burst from his office clutching an old drawing he'd made in 1908. It showed a backpack with twin cylinders, a hose, and a crude ignition sketch, an early device meant to throw fire. Hermann's quip had brought the memory back. About 20 feet in front of them, a man wore the newly built prototype on his back. He held a hose that ended in a metal wand. Fiedler stood nearby, lighting a strip of cloth soaked in kerosene and wrapped around the tip of the wand. The idea was that the kerosene-soaked wick would stay burning and ignite the stream of fuel being forced out of the pack by compressed nitrogen. The man was just about to release the fuel into the flame when Hermann thought of something. "Wait, not yet." Fiedler, already impatient, was not happy about the interruption. "What is it, Klein?" Hermann looked around for anyone wearing gloves. He saw none. Instead, he took off his jacket. "Sir, once this thing is lit, the heat from the flame is going to travel back along the wand and into the hose. Not just the fuel coming out, but the—" Fiedler interrupted him with a frown. "The liquid in the hose." "Yes, sir, and the hose itself." Fiedler nodded once, realizing the danger. "Good thinking, Klein. Wrap the first section of the hose with the cloth." He turned to the others. "Of all the days for none of us to carry gloves, huh?" Hermann stepped back after the wand and hose were wrapped in his jacket. "Nice catch," said Fritz under his breath. "That was close," he returned. He started to bite his nails, an action that often projected his nervousness. The man pulled on the ignition trigger and, just as designed, a lick of flame shot out from the wand at the end of the hose. It was long and devastating. It worked. Then, just as suddenly, the fire stopped. The man holding the apparatus was still squeezing the trigger. "Let go of the trigger," Hermann heard Fiedler say. Hermann watched as Fiedler approached to inspect the wick. It had gone out. Fiedler had sat at the front of the transport on the ride back to the lab, his sketchbook balanced on his knee. He drew the entire time, pencil scratching against the paper, not saying a word to anyone. Hermann watched him for a moment, then looked away. His own mind was exploring possibilities, half-formed ideas drifting in and out, none of them useful yet. Like the others, he stayed silent. Now, back at his small desk, he sat back in his chair, his mind still racing with thought. He was grasping at any idea that could improve the wick. The lights hummed above him. It was interesting to him how they worked, how one could simply flick a switch and the light would snap to life. He understood that electrical current was always in the wire, flowing back and forth, and the switch simply finished the connection to allow the current to reach its end goal, the light bulb. The fuel in the hose, much like electricity, would always be in the hose until released. The wick had been the end goal for the fuel, but it was not reliable. The ignition wore out, and if it was raining, then forget it. They needed a constant flame, one that would not go out. But how? "I've got it," he said aloud. The men in the room turned toward him. He began to draw, and Fiedler stepped out of his office, curious. "We create another tank. It will attach to the bottom of the pack and hold kerosene. Then a small tube will run from that tank to the end of the wand. We light it, and the steady flame will stay lit. When the fuel from the main tank hits that flame, we will have our ignition." It sounded so simple as he said it, but he knew that he had no idea how to actually build it. He looked up just in time to see Fiedler disappear back into his office and shut the door. "That seems like a no," added Fritz. An hour later, Fiedler emerged. "Klein, can I see you in my office, please?" Hermann obeyed and made his way to the small, dark office. He had only been in Fiedler's office one other time, and that was the day he was brought on and the expectations for the department had been set. Fiedler kept his office tidy and organized. A file cabinet stood against the wall, and just above it, Hermann could see the original drawing Fiedler had made in 1908 pinned in place. "Close the door. Have a seat," Fiedler ordered. Hermann complied. Fiedler handed him a piece of paper. "Take a look at that. Is that what you envisioned?" Hermann looked down at the paper. It was a sketch of the idea he had spouted off earlier. From the looks of the drawing, it was exactly as Hermann had described. A small reservoir had been added to the bottom of the pack, just under the other two tanks. A tube ran from the reservoir to meet the main hose, continuing all the way to the wand. Fiedler had even drawn a small flame emerging from the tube, aimed directly in line with the wand at the end of the hose. "That's exactly what I envisioned, sir, but to be honest, I would have no idea how to make it work. How do we make the kerosene in the bottom pack flow through the tube without a propellant?" Fiedler sat back in his chair, a smile forming on his face. "That's the easy part. We already have compressed nitrogen in the main system," Fiedler continued. "We add a branch from that line into this small reservoir, a separate valve, much smaller. It'll keep the kerosene under light pressure, just enough to feed the flame. No gravity tricks, no hand pumps. The gas does the work." Hermann was taken aback. It sounded so simple. "So we do use propellant? Just the propellant that's already available? That's rather genius, sir." Fiedler leaned forward, his elbows landing on his desk. He clasped his hands together. "It will work." A week later, they were back in the field to test again. This time, The hose had been wrapped in layers of fabric to protect the operator's hands should heat travel back through the line. The new reservoir had been added, and a thin metal tube ran along the underside of the hose, secured in place with tight twists of wire. The tube ended in a 90-degree bend that pointed upwards towards the metal wand at the end of the hose. A small flame burned at the tip of the tube. It danced in the daylight, pale blue and steady. Fiedler had created a small wooden structure about 10 feet from the man holding the apparatus. They were calling it a Flammenwerfer, a flamethrower. The man pulled on the ignition. A stream of flame shot from the end of the wand towards the wooden structure, and it did not take long for the dry wood to ignite and begin to burn. However, Hermann, along with everyone else, was anxious about the next part of the test. Would the flames cease when the ignition switch was released? Fiedler gave the command, "Shut it down." It was a tense moment. If the device worked as they wanted it to, the ignition switch would be depressed, the liquid would cease to flow, and the flame would revert back to its small blue form. But if it did not work, then the flame would continue burning at full strength with no way to stop it. That is, until the liquid had been entirely depleted. Many thoughts filled Hermann's mind at that instant. Most notably, he worried about the actuator situated at the beginning of the wand. What if the heat had damaged it? What if it had expanded and it could not close? If that happened, the operator would be in real danger, especially if the flame followed the fuel back through the wand, down the hose, and into the pack itself. The man depressed the ignition, and the flame died down dramatically in an instant. Hermann let out a sigh of relief as he watched the man turn a small knob at the end of the metal tube to extinguish the small blue flame that had been dancing from the nozzle. The test was a success. The weapon worked. This would change the face of the war. The transport vehicle jolted over rocks and uneven ground as they made their way towards a place called Hogue in Belgium. The small village was heavily contested, and High Command wanted the enemy driven out for good. Hermann looked through the wooden slats at the landscape as it passed. The land was pockmarked with shell holes. Trees had been shorn from the earth, some splintered and jagged, pointing towards the sky, with no canopy left at all. There had been about 20 of the flamethrowers produced so far, and all of them had been packed into another transport truck, making the journey as well. It had been decided that the apparatus would be carried by 2-man teams, one man to wear the pack and another to carry and control the hose. The pack itself was heavy, far too heavy for a single operator to manage for long. During early tests, they had tried using one man, but the moment mobility was added to the trials, it became obvious that no single soldier could handle both the weight of the tanks and the force of the hose. A man burdened with the pack simply could not move, aim, and react quickly enough in the field. This would be the first deployment and the first true test of the weapon's efficiency. The goal was to penetrate enemy trench systems and clear them out with the flames. It would be a surprise attack preceded by a massive bombardment. The transport came to a stop. Hermann, Fritz, and 3 others jumped out the back and were shown to their quarters. Fiedler had stayed behind in Berlin. He had already been handed other assignments. The attack would take place in the morning hours, well before the British troops on the other side would ever expect it. It was only mid-afternoon, but Hermann knew that in just a few short hours he would be needed to witness the deployment of the weapons. He crawled into a cot and fell asleep. It was midnight when Fritz shook him awake. "It's time." Groggily, Hermann asked, "Already?" "It's midnight, and we have an hour walk to the front. Get dressed." "I am dressed," Hermann added. "You slept in your clothes?" asked Fritz. "Yeah, didn't you?" Fritz had a strange look on his face when he replied, "Of course not." Hermann laughed. Hope you didn't get bit by rats and bugs while you lay in your Unterhosen. Ashamed, Fritz responded, "Let's just go." An hour and a half later, the two men were at the front, in a room that had been dug out from the walls of the trench. From outside, they can hear the occasional explosion of a shell or the pop of gunfire. Hermann had never been this close to combat before, and he could barely conceal his fear. A major spoke to the men assembled, about 10 in all. "Today we demonstrate the power of German ingenuity. With us are two of the engineers that worked on the weapons, Hermann Klein and Fritz Schlesinger. They're here to assist us with the deployment of the weapon. Also, they will report our success to High Command." Brief introductions were made around the room, names Hermann would forget in a matter of minutes. He knew that he would never see these men again. Most come from places far across the empire, and deep down he knew that some would not survive the war. The major continued, "In 2 hours' time, we will send the men equipped with the flame weapon out towards the enemy. They will be followed by mop-up troops. They will have to be silent and move unnoticed." He looked around the room. "Once we feel they are in position, we will start a brief bombardment. The shelling will last 3 minutes. The men with the fire weapon will then make their presence known to the enemy." With the plan in place, Hermann and Fritz made their way to the rear of the line, to a nearby field being used as a storage area where the weapons were kept and the teams were waiting. They had practiced with these same men a week earlier in the field just outside Berlin, far from the prying eyes of enemy aircraft that often flew overhead, taking photographs and reporting positions back to their command. The drills had been controlled, calm, even predictable. Tonight would not be. It took a half an hour before all 20 teams were fitted with the weapon and ready to go. Hermann took a moment to take in the faces of these young, brave men, the best Germany had to offer. They were about to embark on a mission that could change the face of the war, or, if they were seen by the enemy, their lives. Time crawled slowly as the men mulled about waiting for the word to embark on their mission. They all made small talk, trying to hide their nervousness, Hermann included. As the hour approached, the field filled with even more men. This was the crew that would follow the flame weapon and pursue a full-fledged attack on the British position. There must have been 200 men here now. From near the sloping cutout that served as the trench system opening, another man whistled. The flame weapon men headed his way, followed by the infantry. Hermann and Fritz brought up the rear, both speechless. They followed the procession of men through the maze of the trench system, the stars and moon providing the only light. All fires, lanterns, and torches had been extinguished to make it harder for enemy gunners to locate them with precision. The ditch eventually emptied into the front line trench, where the men dispersed to Hermann's left and right, leaving him standing in what felt like a narrow hallway. Then it began. The men slowly climbed out of the trench and lowered themselves onto their stomachs. Hermann lost sight of them as soon as they crested the lip of the trench, but he could imagine them all moving forward in silence, inching through the darkness just as they had practiced for hours in that field outside Berlin. It took 15 minutes to empty the trench of all the men involved in the operation. Many more stayed back in the event the operation was unsuccessful and the enemy retaliated. Hermann and Fritz made their way to the elevated lookout they had been shown after the first briefing. It sat above the trench like a hidden alcove, reinforced with sandbags and sheets of steel, its front masked with torn canvas smeared in mud. From a distance, it would look like nothing at all, just another jagged edge of the trench wall. Inside, it was barely wide enough for the two of them to stand shoulder to shoulder. The night pressed in on all sides. They peered out through a narrow slit cut between layers of timber, but they could see nothing beyond the darkness. No shapes moving across the field, No glint of equipment, no flicker of lamps from the enemy line. It was a void, silent and suffocating, broken only by thin slivers of moonlight and faint trembling stars. Hermann felt his breath catch. Somewhere out there, 20 teens were crawling towards danger, and from this vantage point he could not even see the outline of a man. After 20 tense minutes, the bombardment began. They looked on through the slits to see the shells drop on the enemy positions. The fires provided enough light to illuminate the men out there now. There were so many, and they were so close. One errant shell in this experiment could be all over before it began. The floor beneath them shook as the artillery rained down just a half a mile away. It was ferocious and constant, and then, after 3 minutes, it stopped. Silence fell. Now was the time. Through the viewing slits they saw sudden tongues of fire burst to life in the darkness, sweeping across the enemy position. The flames moved in several arcs at once, bright and violent, burning whatever and whoever lay in their path. After a few minutes, they too stopped, and the gunfire began. He had slept only 3 hours before being awakened yet again by Fritz. "Come on, buddy. It's time to inspect our work." He groaned. "Oh, but Ma, do I have to?" Fritz played along and increased the pitch of his voice. "Yes, we do. Now get up, you little brat." He fixed his voice. "We need to document the results. That's why we're here." Reluctantly, Hermann rose and stretched. Still being dressed, he put on his boots. They made their way out of the tent and towards the opening of the trench. Along the way to the front, they were patted on the back by many of the men and greeted with sentiments about how they ended the war, or they changed everything. The soldiers on the German side were elated with the previous night's results. When they reached the very front, they noticed that it was practically deserted. "There's nobody here," Hermann mentioned. "That's because they moved forward to the trench we took last night," replied Fritz. "That makes sense." And with that they found a parapet and climbed out. Hermann was not prepared for what was no man's land. The shell holes, the torn and tattered barbed wire, the mud, and the bodies. So many bodies, some missing limbs, others intact but staring lifeless at the high sun in the sky. The obstacles made traversing the space difficult, and they both tripped more than once over rocks, debris, and even a severed foot in a boot. Eventually, they reached the British lines. The walls had been charred black from the fire. The wooden beams that held up the walls were now ash. The walls could collapse any second. The British had fallen back. But to where? Hermann jumped down into the trench. He and Fritz started to take notes of the damage. He was relieved that there were not many charred bodies. That made sense. The British probably fell back during the bombardment, so most of the fire damage was structural. Still, he walked around taking notes on this or that. He saw a dugout, which was a room dug into the side of the trench. Curious, he entered. Very little light filled into the space, and as a result, he could not see much. He looked for a lantern. There was one on the hook by the entrance. He took it and left the dugout. "Hey, Fritz, you got a match?" Fritz turned and produced a box of matches. They lit the lantern, and Hermann returned to the dugout. He wished instantly that he had not. There was an overturned table in the center of the room, and along the walls he saw them. The bodies, charred and still. Hermann approached the body with its hand raised in a final attempt to shield the face. The hands had taken most of the fire, and the face was the only part that still looked human. He stared at it, uncertain if it had been a man at all. The features were soft, almost childlike. It looked like a boy. The eyes were still open, and in them Hermann saw fear that seemed to linger even in death. Whatever his last moments had been, they had not been gentle. Fritz appeared beside him, also looking at the boy. "This is inhumane." Hermann could only muster 4 words. "What have we done?" You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.